Hello, I'm Linda Whitlow Knight, a member of the Nashville law firm of Gullett, Sanford, Robinson, and Martin. We're at my firm today, Wednesday, August 13th, 2014, to interview 22nd Judicial District Public Defender Claudia Spence Jack, my friend of well over 20 years, as part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Tell us your full name.
My full name is Claudia Jean Spence Jack.
What is your date of birth?
March the 13th, 1943.
Where were you born?
Lebanon, Missouri.
What were your parents' full names?
Claude Pierce Spence and Edna Frances Bell Spence.
Where was your father born?
He was born in Warrenton, Georgia.
And when was he born, and when did he pass away?
He was born in 1919 and passed away at the age of 67.
Where was your mother born?
She was born in Macon, Georgia, and she was, I don't remember the year she was born, sometime around the same year as Daddy, I think, and she died March the 13th, 2010.
I had the pleasure of meeting your mother a couple of
my
times. Yeah. We interrupted each other. I just wanted to say I had the pleasure of meeting your mother a couple of times, and she was just delightful, and it was obvious that the two of you were very close.
We were very close, particularly in the later years, when we had time for each other.
Exactly. What were your parents' educational backgrounds?
My mother had a business diploma from a business school, not college, but post-high school. And my father's ROTC unit was called to active duty while he was a senior in high school, so he never technically graduated from high school, but was awarded a diploma on his return from the war as a captain and as a pilot.
Well, I was going to ask you, what was your father's career?
He was, of course, drafted. His unit was called to active duty while he was a senior, and so he went through basic training and was in the Army. Later, the Army formed a branch called the Army Air Corps, and he elected to learn to fly planes and did so, and then was a part of the United States Air Force when that division was formed.
And he made his career in the United States Air Force then?
Yes, he did.
Did your mother work outside the home?
She was a volunteer and on occasion would work in the mercantile business.
Who were your father's parents?
My father, I knew them as Ma and Pa. Pa worked for the railroad and Ma was a homemaker. They lived in Macon, Georgia.
And what were their names?
Bessie Spence was grandmother, was Ma, and Pa was, I can't remember. I'm so nervous.
Oh, don't be. Your writing indicated that your grandmother served in the Army. Is that correct?
My mother's mother did serve in the Army, and we have a picture of her in uniform. I don't know anything about her service. I did not know either set of grandparents very well because, of course, Daddy was in the Air Force and we were moving around, and we didn't have the same opportunity for close relationships with his parents or her parents as we would have under normal circumstances.
Of course. Did you have siblings?
Yes, I have a brother, David Randolph Spence, who lives in Montgomery, Alabama, and he was career Air Force.
I see. And you were born in Lebanon, Missouri, you told us. How was it that you came to be born in Missouri?
that was one of Daddy's stations, and then he went from Lebanon to another state for bivouac purposes and training purposes. And so Mother, because she was just about to deliver me, was advised by her doctor, whose name was Dr. Love, to stay in Lebanon and not follow him. And so we stayed there until I was about 2 weeks old.
And then you joined your father?
Well, not exactly. The general's wife, who had stayed behind with Mother, offered Mother a ride in her car. She had a driver and a car. And of course Mother accepted, and I was placed in a little bassinet on the back seat of the car with Mother, and off we went to, I think it was Arizona or Wyoming.
You were born during World War II. Do you remember anything about the war?
No.
Do you remember your father coming home from the war?
No.
You were too little?
Yes.
You told us that your father was in the service, and I understand that he was shot down over Germany and escaped during a transfer between prison camps and saved his entire crew. Do you know how he escaped and how he saved his crew?
I know only by reading an account that he had to write, of course, when he was debriefed. And I don't remember too many details. They were on a prison transfer, and I guess the night lighting was just perfect so that they were able to escape, but he did lead his entire crew out, and they all survived.
You said that you learned this from your father's reports. Did he ever talk about his service in World War II?
No, he would tell us details, not about the war, ever.
Mm-hmm.
Even when we asked. But children of that age, I think, it never occurred to me to really get him to resurrect those thoughts if he had, we were very respectful of his privacy.
Do you think they were too painful to him to talk about, or did he just think nobody would really be interested, or
what do you think
his feelings were?
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I think that he preferred not to be thought of as a hero. I know that he was wounded with shrapnel when he was piloting the plane, and he didn't receive the Purple Heart by his own design.
Oh. I know that flyers felt that their planes were almost human, and they gave them names and painted pictures on the fuselage and so forth. Can you tell us the story of your father's plane?
The plane was named Heavy Date, and there was a large painting of a very nice-looking woman, I'll say scantily clad. She was in a bathing suit, but of course bathing suits were a lot different than they are now, and so she was totally covered. But we saw all of this at one of the reunions my brother and I took my mother to, because a man had become so interested in the stories of this 101st Bomb Division that he made a replica of the plane. And we never did see it fly, but we saw pictures of it, and I understand that it did indeed fly at a later time.
That is fascinating. As an Army and then an Air Force family, I'm sure you moved around a lot. What are your earliest memories of where you lived?
I'm not sure that they're really memories or that they're sort of pictures that I've seen, photographs and home movies of playing on a blanket when Mother would be there with me and other little children. We were just babies, maybe 2 years old.
And where would that have been?
That would have been in Warrenton, in Warner Robins, Georgia.
Is that an Air Force base?
It's an Air Force base south of Macon.
Then what are the first actual memories that you have? Where were you stationed when you began to have actual memories?
We were, Daddy was transferred to Japan, and we went with him. I was the only child then. My brother was born over there in 1949. in occupied Japan, so there was never a question about his citizenship. But as we later learned, was, you know, a very serious consideration for many people. But he was, I remember being in Japan and where we lived in a 2-story apartment. We had household help who were Japanese, and they loved me very much. I had great freedom to roam within the, I guess we were in a compound, otherwise I wouldn't have been permitted to roam around freely. I remember a guard, and I don't know why we had a guard, but he had a little guard house, and not too far from our apartment. And he would give me green tea or Japanese tea, which of course I thought was very exciting. And we would visit, and I can't even remember how we communicated because I certainly didn't speak any Japanese, and I would doubt he spoke much English.
What do you remember about the trip to Japan?
All I know is what Mother told me, of course, but, and so some of it I think that I have visualized enough to think that I'm actually remembering it. But we went through a terrific typhoon, and I know that Mother told me she was afraid that we were going to sink, and that she said I was oblivious to all the rough weather, and that in the nursery they had for all of us children, that I enjoyed being on the rocking horse and flying down the floor when we would have hit a big wave.
Do you remember sights that you saw in Japan?
Yes, and again, they're reinforced by home movies, but I remember going to the Buddha at Kamakura, and I remember the brass piles, just huge mountainous piles of brass that were collected from the Japanese citizens and melted down to make shell casings for ammunition. I can still remember the smells and the feelings that I had. I was never afraid, always felt comfortable, and I'm sure it was because of my family's attitude toward me. I just was always protected and felt free to do whatever I wanted to.
You seem to have beautiful memories of living in Japan, and the kindness of the Japanese people to you, and being able to go about freely and see Japanese places. Were the people, did you sense any reserve on the part of the Japanese people toward Americans since the war was so recent when you were living there?
I did not, and Mother and Daddy, I'm sure, contributed to that because they were friendly with many of the Japanese, and some of them really became very good friends. And upon our departure, we were given a number of gifts from Japanese families.
And are those gifts still in your family today?
Yes, ma'am, and most of them are in my house now, since
such
Mother
as?
died. Well, I have a large Chinese charger. It's not quite as large as the table in front of me, but it is large, probably 3 feet across. I have a lot of vases and some Amari china. And in particular, I remember a brass object that we had several sizes. It is of a stork standing on the back of a turtle with a fish out of his mouth, and I think that represents the cycle of life or something like that. Mm-hmm. It's important to the Japanese because they had them everywhere.
That sounds fascinating. Oh, this was very shortly after the Japanese surrendered on the deck of the battleship Missouri. When you lived there, was Japan still under the military control headed by General Douglas MacArthur?
I have no idea about that. I was much too young to be aware of any political situation there, but I do know that we were in what they called occupied Japan.
Were things scarce when you lived there? Do you remember that certain things were hard to obtain?
Oh, it was so funny. Everybody would just go, all the women, the wives, would be so excited when you had deliveries to the commissary of fresh fruits and vegetables. Because they weren't available. We had no fresh milk. We made milk from a powdered concentrate, adding water to it that, of course, Mother boiled. But I remember one time Mother was giving a dinner party, and the strawberries had just come into the commissary, and she made the prettiest, tallest strawberry shortcake I believe I'd ever seen in my life, then or since. And before she served it, I went in and picked every single strawberry off the top of that cake. And I thought I would be in so much trouble, but I just couldn't resist it. And she never fussed, and everybody thought it was very hilarious.
Oh, my goodness. Do you have memories of what life was like on a day-to-day basis, or do you just remember the highlights?
Just the highlights. I remember having the measles and being quarantined. One dramatic event that happened while we were there is that I was playing with a girlfriend 2 or 3 doors down, and we were both wearing silk kimono and playing dolls or whatever we played then, and she backed into a space heater and her kimono went up in flames, and I ran out and called Mother, who came with a blanket and wrapped her in it, and she was then transported to a larger hospital that could take care of her, and she recovered. I was very glad of that, but it was indelible in my mind from that day on.
Certainly. Were your associates and playmates other military children, or did you play with Japanese children?
I never played with Japanese children.
You were in Japan until after your brother was born in 1949?
That's correct.
And what do you remember the return trip? How did you get back? And
I remember that David cried the entire trip and spent it on Daddy's chest. Daddy trying to console David, and I guess Mother trying to keep me in order, but we didn't know it at that time, but he was lactose intolerant. And so, of course, everything they did to try to make him feel better made him worse.
oh dear. Do you feel that your time in Japan has affected your life since then? Did it play a role in shaping your character or your personality, or?
I don't think so. I was just 4 years old. My childhood was just a very happy childhood wherever I was, and I was never really aware that moving was traumatic in any way. It was just a natural part of our life, and for many places we were stationed for long periods of time, and so it wasn't the same as picking up and moving every 2 years.
Yes. Did you go through Hawaii on your way back?
We did, and I remember that vividly because the pineapple fields, I'd never seen anything like the pineapple fields. They were so beautifully laid out. The rows were so straight, and you knew what the plants were, and the smell was just extraordinarily delicious. And they even had pineapple juice coming out of the water fountains.
Oh my goodness.
I know it. I think we were at the Dole Pineapple Plantation.
I didn't know there was any other kind.
I know.
Have you ever been back to Japan or Hawaii since then?
No.
Never have. Would you like to?
No.
You arrived back in the States then, or in the mainland. Well, the States was the mainland at the time. You arrived back in the States in 1949. So where did your family go then?
Daddy was stationed at Dobbins Air Base in Marietta, Georgia, and we lived there for 5 years.
So from 49 till about 1954.
Yes.
So you would have been then about the age of 7 and the age of 12 when
Exactly.
you arrived and
Yes.
departed. And you went
Happy times.
you went to school in the community, right?
Yes.
Not-
We had a driver who came by, and I guess what we'd consider now a little bus van or something. There were 4 of us that went to school, and he would take us to school and come back and get us and bring us home in the afternoon. I went to Keith Elementary School, which was 1 grade, 1 building. You know, 1 building with single grades, and all the teachers were spinsters, and the principal was a spinster. But the principal and the teacher visited each child's family once a year. And when Miss McGuirk and Miss Iris visited my mother and daddy, they told them that I had announced that I was allergic to milk and black-eyed peas. And they had never heard of that, so they told on me that day.
They set them straight, huh?
That's right.
And that your aversion to milk came from when you had to drink powdered reconstituted milk in Japan, right?
I have no idea where it came from, but to this day I don't drink milk.
And do you eat black-eyed peas?
Oh yes, I eat black-eyed peas now. I outgrew that allergy.
At least on New Year's.
Yes.
What was your education like?
Well, it was a very loving environment, if you can imagine that in a school. The school was small, the classes were small, probably about 20 students in a room, and the teachers were so caring about us. They were rigid in their classroom presentations, but you could tell that they really cared about our learning, and that's when you had reading groups, you know, where you sat around in a circle and took turns reading. We were still having bomb drills where we ducked and covered, either under our desks or into the hallway, depending on the type drill it was. We made, I remember making Red Cross boxes for the troops. We would get this little box that we would put together, probably about that big, and put various things that would be pleasing and useful to the troops, some safety pins, some washcloth, some soap, toothpaste, and a toothbrush.
That would have been for the troops in the Korean War?
Yeah, I guess.
It sounds like you had an excellent education.
I did.
In the post-war South.
Well, we all knew each other and were just close and normal children. Recess, and I remember one time I went home with one of my classmates. I don't remember if I spent the night. I don't think I did, but at least I did go home with one of my classmates named Jessie Faye. And it was the first time I had ever been in someone's house where the family was impoverished. And it made a distinct impression on me. I remember going into the bathroom, and the tub was full of water. And I said, Jessie Faye, don't you want to let this water out? And she said, oh, no, we don't do that until Saturday. And I later learned that her family drew the water on Saturday, and the entire family bathed in that water all week long. And I'd never seen or even heard of anything like that before, and it made an indelible impression on me.
I should say so. Did you watch television when you lived there in Marietta?
We ultimately had a television. Before we had a television, you'd go downtown to the furniture store and watch the television, you know, outside the
in the store window.
In the window. And but then we did have a black and white television Mostly we listened to the radio, and we had a big Philco radio that we listened to, and I was permitted to choose a program every now and then, and Dark Shadow, and you know, those things that I remember.
Right.
Telling my age now.
Oh. Do you recall watching any special programs on television when you were at school?
We did all assemble in the library one time when Queen Elizabeth II was in her coronation. How do you say that? Being crowned, and we all watched that coronation. The entire school crowded into one library with one little television, but we saw it live, and it was very exciting. And I remember that experience to this day.
Absolutely. Did you make friends with children in the community, or stick with the children on the Air Force Base?
I didn't see any of the other children on the Air Force Base, but infrequently, except for two friends of my parents. One was in an iron lung as a result of polio, and one, I don't know what the name of her disease was, but she was confined to a wheelchair. And Mother would take me to visit at least Nania, who was in the iron lung, every weekend, and I would read to her. And then I saw similar names, Nadia, who was in the wheelchair. I read to her too, but I don't think I saw her as frequently as I did Nania in the iron lung. It was very not interesting, but frightening.
I'm sure that had quite an effect on you.
Yes. I didn't want to be in one.
No, but I'm sure it also gave you quite a feeling for people who did suffer like that.
Well, I saw more. I felt like I was seeing more than most in retrospect. I feel like I saw more of people's problems in their lives at an early age.
Absolutely. You also had a friend, didn't you, whose grandfather lived in a special home?
Oh, my best friend was Gwen Wells, and it was so much fun to go in and stay with her. She played the piano, and I always wanted to play the piano, but we couldn't have a piano because we moved too frequently, so I played the accordion, which I did not want to play, but it was the only alternative I had. And in fact, there is an hysterical picture of me on the front row with my legs spread apart, holding a huge accordion, a frontini, and in an accordion band, if you can imagine.
Well,
but, excuse me. But Gwen was my best friend, and either she would come to see me or I would go to see her almost every weekend. It was before families had two cars, but Gwen's mother had a Model T that was peculiar because it had a mind of its own, and her name was Emily. Emily would have to crank the car to get it started, and then she would take us wherever we were going, because it was great fun to ride in. But I'd never seen anything like that, and oh my goodness, it was like a job because it was hard to maneuver. But Gwen and I did visit back and forth, and her grandfather was the president at Georgia State College for Women in Milledgeville, which was also the home of the Georgia Insane Asylum, and was also one of the first capitals in the state of Georgia, it was the capital of Georgia. So he Guy Sr. lived in the governor's mansion, which was had been converted to the had been converted to the president's mansion. And oh my goodness, we would have the best time in the world when we visited there, because there was a bowling alley and a ballroom, and we just had the run of the place. And there were secret tunnels underneath that we played in. We probably weren't supposed to, but we learned, we thought we were very special getting to do those things.
Well, the war between the states was only 90 years in the past at the time you lived there. Were there reminders of the war around Marietta, Georgia at the time, in Milledgeville?
In Milledgeville, the only reminder that I remember was the tunnels under the governor's mansion. I don't know that we were able to roam freely in Milledgeville, but in Marietta, when I visited Gwen, we could walk to Kennesaw National Park, and it was free, you know, to just go in and wander around. We crawled up in all the tunnels and climbed all over the cannon and found artifacts. I had a friend who's a very prominent lawyer there now, Jimmy Berry. He had a grand collection of Civil War memorabilia. I don't remember that we ever removed anything. I think we were cautioned not to.
Mm-hmm. When you were living in Marietta, in that part of the country, did your family take the opportunity to travel around? Did you go to other places while you were stationed at Marietta?
I don't remember that except going to Florida.
And what did you see in Florida?
Well,
What do you
I remember
about
one time Gwen went with us and we went to St. Augustine, drank from the Fountain of Youth, because that meant we were going to live forever. And then went to Silver Springs and rode in the glass-bottom boats, and they were making a movie called The Creature from the Black Lagoon. And oh, we'd just never seen anything so bizarre in our lives. And we went to the snake farm where Mr. Ross Allen, milked the snakes so that they could make antivenom medicine from it. And things were not commercialized like they are now.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like visiting in someone's home or their backyard or something like that, more than going to a big park.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever go see The Creature from the Black Lagoon in the movies?
Absolutely.
At the theater? Uh-huh.
Absolutely.
Did you pick out scenes that you had seen being filmed?
No, but I recognized him.
The creature?
Yes.
Who played the creature?
I don't know. It was frightening.
He was in pretty much makeup, I would say.
Well, he was in a suit,
Uh-huh.
and anybody that was in that movie, they had very short spurts of acting because they'd have to go to their air hoses and breathe and then dispense with that and go back and act a little bit. It was not like they do today.
Well, in 1954, your father changed duty stations again, right?
Yes.
You moved from Milledgeville. Where was his next duty station?
Well, we moved from Marietta.
I beg your pardon.
And we went, Mother and David and I went to Albuquerque, New Mexico. My grandmother had left her home there to go to Houston, Texas. And we lived in her house for that year that Daddy was in Thule, Greenland. And I think that was the first time that I learned anything about budgeting. Mother had a calendar that she kept on top of a chest of drawers, and we would fold up a dollar bill on every day of the month at the beginning of the month and would move it like checkers down until we accumulated enough money to go to the movie or do something that we wanted to do. And I guess that was the first idea that I ever had, that you had to save money in order to spend it on something that cost more than $1.
That's a pretty good lesson, wasn't it?
Well, I wish I had paid more attention to that.
Did you not see your daddy for a whole year then?
We saw him briefly when my grandmother died. She died in Houston. David and I stayed with neighbors while she went to be by her mother's side. And Daddy was allowed to come home and go to the funeral and then go back to Thule, Greenland. But other than that, we didn't see him.
How had your grandmother wound up in Albuquerque, of all places?
I cannot tell you. I think she was about on her third husband, and he was in the military, and for some reason they were in Houston.
I see. Well, tell us about what it was like to live in Albuquerque, because I can't imagine any place more different than Marietta, Georgia, than Albuquerque.
Correct. I had never experienced anything like it, and of course I was junior high age, and so much more aware of my surroundings and what I was seeing. We went to the Indian ceremonies in Santa Fe, which, we have a Santa Fe in, in Murray County, but in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the Indians had their celebrations where they would all come together and dance, and we would watch the dances. But mostly what I remember is they all got drunk, and it was a little frightening. But the dances were beautiful and, of course, very authentic, and they took it very seriously, and so did we.
I'm sure. So your father came home from Greenland, and you were reunited as a family again. And where was he stationed next?
At Dobbins Air Base in...
And where was that again? I'm sorry.
No, let's see. After Greenland, we moved to Montgomery, Alabama.
To Maxwell, but
Maxwell Air Base.
Yeah.
Where he was in the Air Command School.
And there's a school at Maxwell?
Yes, and a prison.
I know about the prison.
I didn't know about that until much later.
How long did you all live in Montgomery then?
I lived there until I moved to Tennessee. That was my technical home.
Mm-hmm.
I moved there in the 8th grade and finished high school there at Robert E. Lee High School.
Did your father have duty after Maxwell, or was that his last duty station?
While he was at Maxwell, he was commissioned to go to Vietnam. And I never understood why he wanted to go, but he really wanted to go. He made a supreme effort to go. He had been diagnosed with diabetes, but it could be regulated with diet and with oral medication. And he was treated by a physician who lived in Montgomery and was not affiliated with the military. And so it wasn't detected because he was able to maintain a balance. Anyway, he went to Vietnam and was stationed at Da Nang for 2 years and flew C-130s over there.
And what was the function of a C-130?
It's a cargo plane, a very large cargo plane, and he flew supplies hither and yon out of Da Nang.
Was he more open about his service in Vietnam than he had been about his service in World War II?
Well, he didn't talk about his work so much. Of course, when he was in World War II, everything was top secret, and he couldn't disclose. Mother never even knew where he was. She'd get a report from the War Department about this, that, or the other, and then she'd get a letter from Daddy, and it was a very confusing time, especially for Mother. We weren't so aware of it, but I can remember her telling me that she got a letter saying that, or a call saying that he was missing in action, and at the same time she got a letter from him, and she just didn't know what to think. But everything was secret. He couldn't disclose where he was or what he was doing or anything during World War II. When he went to Vietnam, we knew where he was, but we didn't know what he was doing because, of course, he couldn't disclose that or discuss it.
Did he describe the Vietnamese people and the cities and the countryside and so forth? Did he tell you what it was like to be in Vietnam?
What I remember that he told me was that it was so disconcerting in Vietnam because everybody looked alike other than the Americans, and that you couldn't tell who was suspicious and who was not. And so they were on constant guard even though they were going about their regular activities during the day and night.
Yes,
I can only imagine.
Yeah, that happened to my father-in-law also. He was stationed there, and someone who would be a barber by day was a Viet Cong by night. So.
Yes.
But Maxwell was his home base at the time he was in Vietnam.
Yes.
So when...
Well, no, Da Nang was his home base then, but then he came back to Montgomery.
And so your mom and you and your brother stayed in Montgomery?
Yes, and I was in college at that time.
At what point did he retire from the Air Force?
He retired, I don't remember the year, but I had finished college and graduate school. And because he was still there when I was in graduate school. And he retired maybe 4 or 5 years after that.
Did they stay in Montgomery after he retired?
Mother and Daddy always maintained their home in Montgomery. We also rented every summer a house on Lake Martin, which is about an hour away from Montgomery, and ultimately they bought a guest house of a house, and Daddy remodeled it so that Mother and Daddy could live in it, and they were living there and renting the house in Montgomery when he died.
I see. Where did you attend school in Montgomery?
Robert E. Lee High School and Capitol Heights Junior High School.
And tell us about what your education was like at those schools and what your social life and activities were like.
In high school, I was an associate editor of the annual and the newspaper and a cheerleader and sang in the chorus and took every course I thought I could pass. I had dreams of going to Agnes Scott College in Atlanta, and because my daddy had wanted me to go there.
What were your favorite subjects?
Latin until Ms. Day threw the eraser at me, and I can't remember for the life of me why she did that, because I was never rude or acted inappropriately, I don't think. But anyway, I liked Latin. I liked math, but was not very good in it. I loved English, and I loved to read. And I had wonderful, wonderful English teachers.
How did your schooling at that stage of your life influence you later on?
I guess my love of English. I majored in English education. During those years, we didn't know we had choices to be anything but a school teacher, a secretary, or a nurse. And I knew I didn't want to be a nurse. I hated shots. And so I entered the School of Education and majored in English education. And that was what my degree is in.
Did you begin to have an awareness at the time that fostered your interest in politics and public affairs and civil rights?
When I was, I think it was my junior year in high school, I always went to summer school. We didn't have a lot of activities for children, and so summer school was an easy alternative for me. And that way I could be with my friends and learn something too. But our history classes were taught mainly by coaches, which means that we had probably a different education in history than many school children did. And so we had a television in our history room, and our teacher thought that it was important that we be exposed. We were having a presidential election, and John F. Kennedy was running. Of course, he was not very popular in Montgomery, even though he was a Democrat, but he was a Catholic, and he was a Yankee, and he talked differently from anybody else. And there was a great discussion about the separation of church and state, and we had lively discussions about it. We weren't allowed really to express ourselves like children are now, and we were relatively unexposed to events of the day when I was in high school. But we did watch the debates. It was very, very interesting to me, and the whole process then became real because we had witnessed it.
Were you aware of the civil rights activities going on in Montgomery and Birmingham and Selma and in the South in general?
I was aware from the news. When I was at Auburn, of course, every school I ever attended other than the one in Albuquerque, New Mexico, was all white. The school in Albuquerque was integrated, both with African American students and Hispanic students, and I guess any other nationality that was represented there. And I never really noticed, you know, they were your classmates and you interacted with them no matter what their color was, and they would come home with me and visit, and so it was just natural, as it was natural to be in Montgomery with all white students. And I know that on the way to Robert E. Lee High School, we passed right by what they call Negro housing projects. And we knew what they were, but we didn't associate any right or wrong about that, because that was just the way life was. And it wasn't until later that many in my age group began to question and then participate in various activities to foster integration.
Now, you didn't just go to school and participate in extracurricular and social activities, you also worked. What did you do?
Well, I worked against the rules. I was in graduate school and teaching the 8th grade, and that was against the rules. You couldn't be a full-time graduate student and work at the same time. But I did it anyway, and I paid for it a little bit with some docking of hours, but I had plenty, so it didn't really, I didn't suffer from it.
Didn't you work during high school also?
Oh, I did, but that was in the summertime or at Christmas vacation, not while I was going to school.
I see.
Oh, my parents would have never permitted that.
You weren't trying to juggle work and school and
not like
activities.
the students do today. I don't know how they do it. And when I was in law school, there were so many people that held really full-time jobs and went to law school. I'll never understand how they did both.
Yeah. Well, but it sounds like you were well on the way to learning the time management skills and work ethic that you put into practice today.
If I ever thought about it. But you know, it was just, you just did whatever you were doing.
Yeah.
And I loved teaching at the junior high school in Auburn. And I liked my graduate courses. I was just sort of fiddle-de-deeing along until I was offered a job in Tennessee.
Well, you finished high school there in Montgomery, Robert E. Lee High School. So then it was time to go to college, and the world was before you. You said that your father had wanted you to go to Agnes Scott, but where did you go to college, and how was the decision made?
Well, it was a decision by default. I had been accepted to Agnes Scott after my interview, and I cried all the way home. It was a rainy day. The trees were all dripping, the buildings were stone, and I felt like it was cold, and I interviewed these women that asked me all kinds of things about careers, and I just was not, I was just out of high school. I wasn't prepared to answer their questions. I had never met a professional woman except for 2 female doctors, and so I had no basis really to consider what life might have in store for me if I made different decisions. Anyway, I declined the invitation, and Daddy told me I could go to Bessie Tift, which was also a woman's college in Georgia, or Auburn. So I chose Auburn and had a wonderful time. It was a good choice for me.
So in retrospect, you are happy that you went to Auburn?
Yes, I wonder what I would have missed. I wonder what I missed by not going to Agnes Scott, a city college and a thriving big city in the South. But I have just had such a happy life, no matter what I was doing, that wherever I found myself, I guess I just accepted it and made the best of it.
Well, you know, Abraham Lincoln said most folks are about as happy as they make up their minds to be.
Well, I
And
think
you
there's
have-
a
you-
lot of truth in that.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard that.
You are an optimist. What was college like for female students?
Oh, it was so much fun. Number one, you were you were out of your daddy's control. You know, we had curfews, but everybody had the same curfew. I wasn't singled out with daddy's curfews. And we were free to wander and experiment with different kinds of friendships and activities. And we had a park near there that had a waterfall, and we'd visit there. And I mean, it was just, you were on your own. And at that time, I will tell you this because I mentioned money, it cost $400 a quarter to go to Auburn, and that included room, board, and tuition.
That's quite enviable.
I know it.
Hard to believe.
We wish our children could go for that.
Hard to believe. What other kinds of rules were there that that bound girl students?
Well, the funniest thing was that when I got there, because I guess I must have accepted late or something. I don't know what the particulars were, but I was assigned to a dormitory that had been converted from a men's dormitory to a women's. It was Auburn Hall, and it was about a half a block from Sanford Hall, which was the key of our college, where all the administrative building and offices were. And I remember getting a telephone call from Dean Catherine Cater. Later found out she was from Macon, Georgia, and she somehow knew that I was there and called me into her office. I was scared to death. And she just wanted to know how I was doing, if I was happy, and if I wanted her to move me from Auburn Hall to the Quadrangle to be with everyone else. And I said no, I had already met my roommate and we were compatible, and that the only real disadvantage was that we had a longer walk to the dining hall, and that we had hall showers and bathrooms. And I guess that was kind of like going to camp, and it just went with the territory, and I accepted it. And I told her, she said, "You sure you don't want me to move you?" And I said, "No, I don't want to be singled out." I said, "The way I look at it is, if I stay here this year, anything later has to be better." And so she had a big laugh, and I had a big laugh, and then she would frequently invite me to lunch or dinner in her home, and I enjoyed that very much.
That's nice. Well, I bet you had rules such as no men allowed in the dormitories.
Oh, well, of course. You better
were,
not try to get past our dorm mother. And you had clocks. You had to stick we had clocks where you had to stick a card in and punch your time. It was like going to work at a factory. You punched it in, you punched it out. When you left, you punched out. When you came back in, you punched in. So it was right there in, I guess, purple and tan for the world to see. And you would be punished if you were late. They'd lock those doors, and the dorm mother would wait on you and greet you and
yes,
take care of you. And we couldn't wear shorts or slacks in public unless we wore a long raincoat over them. Weekday curfew was 8:30, except for Friday, and we could stay out until 10:30. Saturday 11, and then back to 9, I think, on Sunday.
but you survived.
Oh, I survived. I loved it. I mean, everybody had to follow the same rules, so we didn't know any better. I mean, that was just the way it was, and a rule was a rule. I've always been fairly rule-abiding.
Yes. Did civil rights issues play more of a role in your college experience? Did you gradually become more attuned to civil rights issues?
Well, of course, the televisions were full of the conflict, and especially in Montgomery, and especially with the march from Selma to Montgomery. And I can remember now, you're young enough, you didn't do this, but we had a telephone, two telephones on each hall, and coin operated, of course. And so you had to share with
I had hall phones in my
with
dorm.
a whole with a whole floor, and take your turns, and you'd better be civil about it, or you wouldn't be very popular. And I remember calling Mother after seeing the African Americans and the fire hoses downtown Montgomery, and I was just so frightened for her, wanted to know if I should come get her. And she said that I was learning as much from our television in the chapter room. I was a Chi Omega fraternity, that I was learning as much as she was, that she was not aware of anything going on downtown. She was not aware of any repercussions from the march from Selma to Montgomery, or King's speeches there at the church in Montgomery. And so I knew that it was happening, and I was frightened for my mother's safety because she was there with my brother, and Daddy was overseas in Da Nang.
What action did you take personally to become involved in the betterment of African Americans, the improvement of their lives and their situations?
I did teach in the first ever Head Start program one summer while I was in Auburn. The children were underprivileged, and I don't think they had ever had any kind of a storybook even in their homes, or had a story read to them. It was very interesting because the children were mostly African American, and the other teachers that I worked with were mostly African American. And it was the first realization that I had that children who grew up in situations different from mine had different outlooks on life. Didn't have they were free and playing and all those natural things that children do, but they didn't have the same advantages that we did in diet, in hygiene, certainly in being exposed to the written word. That made a dramatic impression on me. I'm thankful for that experience.
Indeed. What did you major in at Auburn, and why did you choose that major?
English education. It was all I knew. And I was, when I was in graduate school, I was a graduate assistant to Dr. Paul Scheid, who was very well known on the Auburn campus, and he helped me a lot and guided me in selecting courses, and I'm sure he's responsible for my being offered a job in Columbia, Tennessee, which ultimately brought me to Tennessee.
Well, before we take a short break, tell us how college evolved or segued into that first job in Columbia. We'll get up to your move to Columbia.
Well, this is hilarious. I was teaching the 8th grade, and they're just on the cusp from being children to adolescence and growing up, and it's such an exciting age to teach. I just loved it. But one day, there was a knock on my door, and I went to answer it, and there were 3 men in business suits. And they asked if they could speak to me, because I knew that they'd been given permission, because otherwise they wouldn't have gotten back to my door. And they asked me if I would like a job, and I said, of course I would like a job. What are you talking about? And they said, I'm sure I didn't say that, but anyway, they said that they were going to start a community college system in Tennessee, and were going to establish the first community college in Columbia, Tennessee, and they wanted me to be a member of their first faculty. Well, I was just overwhelmed, and I said, well, yes, I would be complimented to be in the first faculty. And they said, well, now you have to finish your thesis. And I thought, uh-oh, because I had just been dilly-dallying around and hadn't that was one of those things I was procrastinating about. So I got busy and finished my thesis and graduated on August the 21st, and on August the 23rd, my brother put everything I owned in the back of a U-Haul trailer, and Mother and I rode in a little Volkswagen, and we landed in Columbia, Tennessee, the dimple of the universe and the mule capital of the world.
So you came to Columbia sight unseen, is that right?
Absolutely. Well, I visited it sight unseen. I came back to find an apartment. And
Did you ever find out how those men came to do their job search at Auburn and then came to recruit you?
I have absolutely no idea, but I know that, I mean, how would they find me down there? Archie Rushton was one of the men, and he was very responsible for the organization of the community college system. And maybe after the break I'll remember the other man's name, that he was ultimately he was the dean of the college. And he was with them. So I guess they just came to look me over and see if they wanted me to come.
Absolutely. Did the fact that you had moved so much as a child, as a child in a military family, make it easier for you to just pick up and move to Columbia?
Well, no. What were you going to do after college but go to work? I mean, I had a master's degree. I either had to stay in school and work toward another degree, which I was not really ready to do, or go be independent and take care of myself. I couldn't expect anybody else to do that. My parents had taken care of me all those years, and I had to borrow a little money for graduate school, but nothing that I couldn't pay back, and did pay back.
Absolutely. Well, we will take a short break now, and when we resume, we'll talk about your life as a Tennessean.
Okay. I'll look forward to that.
We do too. Claudia, you have now arrived in Columbia, Tennessee, and you have become a Tennessean. Tell us again the title of the job that you were hired to do in Columbia.
I was hired as an English instructor of English at Columbia State Community College, which was the first community college in the state. In addition to that, it was the first one in a system that had already been designed so that there would be a community college within a 50-mile radius of any student. That was the goal, was that anyone who wanted 2 years of college education could, within a radius of 50 miles, attend a community college. And they did that. Tennessee did that. It was one of the first systems in the country. You had some community colleges in Florida, and I don't remember where else, but this was designed not just for individual community colleges, but as a complete system. And it was very, very exciting. I had found an apartment with the help of a lot of people there in Columbia that was really the attic of the Gladstone Apartments, which was on the side street, across the street from Episcopal Church, where I attended, and across the parking lot to the Baptist Church, where we had our classes. Our college was set up in an administrative building on West 7th Street, about 2 blocks away from the Baptist Church, and our classrooms were inside the Baptist Church. So I taught Faulkner to the praying hands of Jesus. And I always thought that was so appropriate. And but anyway, I got there, and the basement of the Baptist Church was our sort of our administrative office. It's where we had a mimeograph machine and a ditto machine and some typewriters and personnel. And then we taught in the Sunday school rooms. And various other places around town if we needed them to. I think we taught chemistry at the chemistry lab at the high school, things like that. We just, everyone was so accommodating because unlike most things that are your first jobs, we were welcomed with open arms by everyone in the community. It was exciting. And I don't know of a single person who had a negative thought about the college. Of course, they didn't really know what it was and how it was going to operate. But I would come out of my third floor apartment, the attic, down the steps, across the parking lot, and go to my classrooms. Before classes started, Dean Clark, who was the acting dean at that time, came to me and said, Claudia, Miss Spence, I guess he called me, Miss Dr. Guidry, who was going to be the head of the humanities, is not able to come for about 6 weeks. And so I need for you to set up the curriculum and design the course outline and order the textbooks. Can you do that? I said, oh, of course I can do that. Well, of course I didn't know what I was getting into, but ultimately I did that. The first thing I did was call the head of the English department at Auburn and explain my situation. And he said, don't worry. I will send you the syllabi for each of the classes that the freshmen and sophomores are studying at Auburn. And it'll have a list of the textbooks. So then I called Harvey Johnson, the owner of Johnston Malone, which is still the leading bookstore there in Auburn, and I told him what my situation was, and he said, don't worry, I'll send you 2 copies of each textbook that's being used in those courses, and that'll get you started. And so when I received those and decided what classes to teach in the first quarter, because we were on the quarter system, which made it very convenient because so was Auburn. And I just, whatever Auburn was doing, we were doing. That was just the way it was. But it was because we didn't know the term networking back then, but I called somebody that I knew could give me the answers I needed and who would be willing to help me. And it was very successful. So the first 2 years I taught there, we were just teaching exactly what they were teaching on the Auburn campus at Auburn, Alabama. And the students, we had a mixture of students, some right out of high school, that would have been their natural progression. And then we had older students who had never had an opportunity to go to college. Many of them had full-time jobs. And so our coursework was designed so that we could give most of the offerings for class work in the evening after they got off work. And it was the most wonderful experience you can imagine because unlike a lot of students that go to their first year of college, these students were excited to come. And they knew that had it not been for this facility, they would never have had the opportunity. And we had young and old mixed in some of the classrooms. Some of the classrooms were all, entering freshmen at the normal age. But the whole community was so behind us, supporting us. They looked forward to this. And even though we were meeting in the Baptist church, which didn't give us the advantage of having a designated real facility, it didn't matter because what we were doing did not require special accommodations. We just needed a room and textbooks and of course that made me use blue books for the tests and all those things. I'd type up the tests on the mimeograph machine and run it, submit it, and make sure it was okay. And there we were. And that's the way we operated for over a year.
Well, it sounds like you were like the duck that looks so serene on top of the water and is paddling like crazy below the water.
I have no idea what I looked like, but I knew that I was supported by everybody I met, and that I was doing something that was totally off the chart as for what I had prepared to do after college, whatever that was. And it was just a wonderful time and a really lovely community. When Mother and I went to see the town, the first thing I did was go to the priest. And he had been there 23 years and was in the process of packing. I said, "Oh, no, Father Gates, I don't want you to leave. We won't have a priest here." And he said he was going to be suffragan bishop and living in Memphis. And I asked him, I said, "I wanted to get an idea, if you have time, about this community I'm moving into." And he said, "Well, young lady, if you want to live in the most wonderful, congenial, friendly, progressive community in the state, you move to Columbia. If you're looking for a husband, don't come, because there has been an exodus of the young people and they don't come back home." And the situation in Columbia, I don't know how this contributed to it or if it even did, but Columbia was a community built on the phosphate industry, and we had great chemical plants. I think there were 7 or 8 of them there then. And it was very hard, dirty, dangerous work. But at that time, a man, and I'm saying a man because it was real physical labor, and so most of the positions, except for secretarial positions, were held by men. They could make enough money, they had enough salary to take care of a family of 4, have insurance benefits, have spousal benefits if something happened to the husband, retirement benefits. And there weren't many jobs like that. And as it turns out, there are not a lot of those jobs even today. But then the phosphate depleted, the resource depleted, and ultimately the chemical companies moved out. Monsanto was a very large contributor, and they were a very generous corporate citizen, as were all the chemical plants. So that made a different atmosphere than you might have expected from the mule capital of the world. But the college was a great success. Ultimately, they built a facility on the Hampshire Pike, just outside town, and we had the dedication. And it was such an important event that Lady Bird Johnson accepted our invitation to dedicate it. And when the president heard about it, he said, "Well, I want to go there too." And so here came President and Mrs. Johnson, but she was the featured dignitary, which he probably enjoyed at that time because of the Vietnam War. And she made a beautiful speech. It was the coldest day I believe I've ever sat outside, and I had on a little red, white, and blue dress in honor of America.
Yes.
And almost froze to death. We almost all froze to death, but we wouldn't have moved for anything. It was so exciting.
Well, you were glowing on the inside,
oh,
right?
yes, and the paper even had as the headline, "A red letter day for Columbia." So that's how that started, and I taught there for 3 years and loved every minute of it.
That was a thrill. Well, let us not forget that when you did this, when you took all this upon yourself that you had never had any idea that you were going to do, you were only, what, 23 years old, perhaps?
23 years old, didn't know diddly.
Well, you knew enough to get it all done, and you had enough ingenuity and gumption to get it all done. But you said that a lot of your classes were taught at night. What did that do to your ability to have a social life in your new hometown?
Oh, I didn't have a social life like I'd had in college, of course, but I was invited at that time, and really for most of my young married life, we didn't have restaurants in town that were open at night for evening meals, and people entertained in their homes, and we would have small dinner parties, large dinner parties, brunches, but would have them in the home. And I was I was always invited. I said I had G on one foot and O on the other, and if you invited me, you better want me to come, because I would be there, and I would have people offer to take me to the celebration in Shelbyville to see the walking horses. I'd never seen a walking horse and didn't know anything about them, and people would just, it was like they were excited to teach somebody new what they loved about the community.
Right, wanted to welcome you and make you feel at home. Well, was your first entree into a social life through your church?
No.
Or through the school, educational
we didn't have, we didn't have a priest for a good while. And so we were, I guess the senior warden was conducting morning prayers or whatever, and I got to be very good friends with older women in the church on the altar guild. It was a warm, wonderful relationship with those older women that knew all the history of the church and history of the families, and so I learned a lot from them. But my second, I guess it was the second year that I taught, there was a dinner dance at the country club, and I really wanted to go. A lot of my female friends were going, and I really wanted to go. And this man called me and asked me if I would allow him to take me. Well, of course, there was no hesitation. I wanted to go. I meant to go to that dinner dance.
You were going to that dance.
I was going, and I had a dress that had a bouquet of violets on the front of it, and oh, I just was so excited. Well, the night came to go to that, and my date's name was Billy Jack. He was a local lawyer in a prominent law firm there, that ultimately became McFarland, Colley, Blank, and Jack. It was McFarland and Colley, then Jerry Colley. And he invited me, but he called, he was late, and I wasn't accustomed to that, and became a little flustered, and then he called me and he said, I am so late, I apologize, but somebody had run into him, and he had a little fender bender, and he said, do you mind just meeting me down at the curb where I pull up to get you? I said, I most certainly do. I said, my daddy'd never forgive me if I did that. And I said, if you don't want to come to my door, then we just must cancel this date. And he climbed up those 3 flights of stairs to get me, and we dated every night since then until we married in 1967 on November the 4th. So it was 6-month courtship, married the love of my life, and we lived happily for 30 years, had 3 fine children, until he died an untimely death.
It was love at first sight, wasn't it?
It was. Dance at first sight.
Meant to be. So you went to the dance after all?
I went to the dance after all, and then after I had taught there for 3 years at Columbia State, and I did a lot of things while I was there. Designed the first yearbook, which was a 2-year edition, and wrote the catalog. In fact, they gave me a hardbound catalog that I just recently presented to the college for their archives.
Oh.
And so I quit to have a family. We were anxious to have children. I was, getting on in age, and we thought that it was dangerous to have babies. We know a lot differently now, but to have babies if you were too old. So anyway, I stayed home, and I think in a year or so became pregnant with Robert, because I had him in 1970. So that would have been 3 years into our marriage.
Before you met Billy, had you met and become friends with other lawyers, or did you know any other lawyers before you met him?
There were several women who befriended me and invited me to join the James K. Polk Memorial Association, which was an organization that supported the ancestral home of James K. Polk, the only existing structure now. And there was a Nashville Polk Association and a Columbia Association. Then they merged, and now we have paid staff, and it's operated as a business. As are most of the things that started out as volunteer organizations. The King's Daughter School, had a volunteer staff and the teachers were paid, but the administrators were not until recently. Now things have changed, more complicated, and you need business structure, and you've got tax consequences, and so that changed the contour of our community, because things just grew into more business-like operations than purely volunteer
yes,
like we had.
Of course.
I remember one thing. I was a member of the Daughters of the King, which was supported the King's Daughter School and supported benefiting those who were less prosperous than we were. And I remember Annie Barton Armstrong inviting me to go with her when she visited some families. And she would always say when we'd go into a home, you see, they have a common table, whether it was in the kitchen or whether it was dining room. She said, anytime you go into a house, a home, and you see a table, you know there's hope for that family.
Oh.
And I said, why would you say that, Miss Anna Barton? And she said, because you sit and you look into the eyes of everyone at the same level. She said, and so the children are just about as tall as the parents, and that's an opportunity for conversation and for expressing your love and feelings for each other. And I always remembered that and have considered my dining room table sort of the center or hub of a family.
That's a lovely insight. So did you meet some lawyers or lawyers' wives through the King's Daughters or the Polk Association?
Well, I don't know. Through a lot of things, people would invite me. I had friends that were horseback riders and teaching children to ride horses and jump and all those things with thoroughbreds. And anywhere I was invited, I went. And one of my good friends was married to Jerry Colley, and she sort of wanted to matchmake, but I didn't really want anybody to do it for me. But when that dance came along, that did it, and I was hooked. I was hooked forever. He was the sweetest man I had ever met in my life, and we just immediately liked each other and grew into love.
I met Billy a couple of times late in his life at the bar convention and so forth, and I don't think I ever met anybody that had a nicer smile, a kinder smile than he did.
Oh, he was wonderful. And Sybil Welchel, who was the wife of one of the bank presidents, called him the man with the golden voice because he made a speech about saving the Polk Gardens. The Baptist church was built in their big building and that was going to cast shadows on the Polk Garden. And he must have been quite an orator, and because she always referred to him as the man with the golden voice that saved the Polk Garden.
Oh, that's great. Well, so you married Billy in 1967 and became a lawyer's wife. You were still teaching at Columbia State at the time?
I was until that third year. So I started I guess I moved there in 1966 and taught there until 1969.
Yeah. So as his wife, though, then you began to move within the legal community as a lawyer's wife.
Whatever activities he participated in that was social and included lawyers, I went right along with him. And we went to the bar convention every year and to the bar picnics that we had in our judicial circuit. And I just always found lawyers very interesting and exciting, and their wives were interesting too, so it was a happy-tappy time.
Well, tell us about your business and civic activities at the time, between the time you quit teaching at Columbia and the time you started law school. What did you do to keep busy other than be a wife and mother and raise a family?
Babies. I was busy with my babies. I had 3 children. Let's see, Robert was born in 70, Laura in 72, and Edward in 75. So they were little stair-steps and the sweetest, best children any mother's ever had in her life. I thought they were just adorable. They were good. They were interested in everything, and I learned a lot through their eyes. Raising the children was one of my favorite things that I've ever done.
And where are your children now, Claudia?
Robert is in Nashville, here in Nashville, working for, he's a manager of some sort with a company called C3 that was founded by a woman here in Nashville. I'm sorry, I can't remember her name. Laura works for, is a manager at Marksbury Farms that's near Danville, Kentucky. And she's married to the soccer coach there and has one child named Charlie, who's 13. Robert and his wife, Whitney, live in Nashville, and they have 3 children. Will, who's 11, Jane, who's 8, and Francis, who's 4. And then Edward lives in Seaside, Florida, or Seagrove, Florida, and he's the manager of a record shop there called Central Records. But we were just a normal, happy family, excited about learning about nature and going to school, and they were good students. It was just the finest time of my life.
Well, eventually the idea came along for you to attend law school. Tell us how it came about that you decided to attend law school or considered attending law school.
Billy had a degenerative disease, and it was limiting his ability, his mobility, and it was progressive. And so we would talk about it every now and then, you know, what would happen if he had to slow down or if it affected his income or whatever. And I had taken a few courses at Peabody. One they taught actually in Columbia at the old high school. And I thought, well, I'll just get a degree in administration and be a principal somewhere, or get a PhD and go back out to the college. Because, of course, as the college progressed, you needed more degree than a master's degree in order to stay there long term. So anyway, I didn't really enjoy those classes, and Billy suggested that I go to law school. I thought that was a very far reach for me and didn't feel up to the task. But after we discussed it, I told him, I said, I'll take the LSAT, and if I make a grade that's acceptable to be accepted, and I'm accepted in law school, I'll go. But I'm not going to let it be the end of my world if I'm not accepted. And I applied to, at that time, the Nashville School of Law was the YMCA School of Law downtown, and it was not accredited. I didn't know the full meaning of that and if it was really important or not. It's less important now than it was to somebody on a regular path of education back then, or so I thought. So I applied to Vanderbilt and practiced the LSAT test. I would sit at a desk for at least 6 hours a day and take those practice tests because, of course, I'd been, you know, flitting around with the children and various activities, and I didn't know if I could sit down long enough to concentrate on a test like that. So I practiced until I could. And then I convinced Dr. B.I. Natty to coach me in mathematics, because a great part of the LSAT test at that time was geometry. So he tutored, I know, go figure. Anyway, he tutored me, and I took the test, and I did okay. I was not probably in the top 10% or anything like that, but I managed to take the test and get a decent grade. So I applied to Vanderbilt. And then I went to interview with Dean Hall. He was the dean of admissions at that time because there was some flux in the faculty at that time.
And that was Dean Don Hall.
Dean
right?
Don Hall, who
Yes.
was absolutely adorable. He was so funny, and he taught criminal law. You wouldn't think you'd be funny teaching criminal law, but maybe that's why I find it so interesting today. Mm-hmm. But he interviewed me, and I remember he asked me a question. He said, "Claudia," he said, "I know you want to come to Vanderbilt, or you wouldn't have applied. Now, if I'm considering an applicant who's just out of college, 23, 24, 22 years old, and I've got his application over here," he did say his, mm-hmm. and yours over here, "why should I select you?" I said, "Oh my goodness, you should not." He said, "What?" I said, "No." And he said, "Why?" I said, "Because that young person will have more years to devote to the profession and more years to reflect well on this institution that I love so much, consider the best law school in the country." And because, of course, I had listened to the propaganda from Billy and Jerry Colley, and it wasn't really propaganda, but they were very proud of having attended. And it was more competitive when I applied. Now, I will say this to anyone who's watching this, that at that time, the tuition at Vanderbilt was $5,000, and you could borrow that from the bursar's office. It was a federal mm-hmm. loan, guaranteed loan. The second year I was in law school, the tuition was $6,000, and the third year, $8,000. So even had I owed that entire amount, it was not such an astronomical amount that I didn't feel comfortable that I would repay. Now I don't know how. I wouldn't even think of it as a possibility now because the tuition is so expensive.
That's a very good point. Well, let me ask you, if you were interviewing for admission to law school now and were asked the same question that Don Hall asked you then, would you give the same answer?
Well, I'm 71 now, so I don't think.
let's pretend you're however old you were at the time.
I don't know. I'd have to be sitting in that chair and ask that question to answer it honestly. I probably would answer the same way.
Did you know any female lawyers during the years before you went to law school?
No. In fact, until I met Jerry Colley and Billy, to my knowledge, I had never met a lawyer, much less a female lawyer.
Let's take a second, and you mentioned the name of Billy's law firm that he was with at the time, McFarland, Colley, Blank, and Jack, and tell who those lawyers were.
Lon McFarland, who was the senior partner and brilliant. His brother's in Murfreesboro. I guess he came from Murfreesboro. I never really did know. But his family was lovely, and they were always lovely to me. And then Jerry Colley grew up in Centerville and was raised by what he called his mammy, which was his grandmother. And he was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth, as neither was Billy. But he went to Vanderbilt and came back and practiced law with Mr. McFarland, who had a very large corporate practice. And Jerry fell into a couple of really high-profile criminal cases and made his reputation. And really, except for the jokes he makes about his knowledge of the rules of evidence, he was just a superior lawyer in every way, and such a gentleman, just a delight to know. And then Bill Kane was in that law firm for a while. He became a circuit judge, and then later on the sat on the Court of Appeals. And Ed Blank, who is now deceased, he was brilliant and well connected in Nashville as far as society families. Married a very good friend of mine, Margaret, and they were already married when we married. But Ed became a state senator and was considered a very good candidate ultimately for governor of the state, but he died an untimely death too.
Mr. McFarland was involved in banking also, wasn't he?
Oh yes, yes, he married into banking. His wife's father started Middle Tennessee Bank, and so that.
Yeah,
yes.
and he was an alumnus of my husband's alma mater, the Virginia Military Institute. So.
Well, he was a very fine man.
Yes. And were those gentlemen involved in politics? I know Mr. Blank obviously was Senator Blank, but
he was, and I don't remember any of the others being particularly. Of course, we supported our candidates, but
yeah.
Later on, Billy and I participated in some campaigns, but not in my early years. I was busy with the family, and he was.
Yeah. Well, back to law school, you talked about your decision to apply, and what did your family think? I know Billy supported it, but what about the rest of your family?
I don't think they even knew about it, except that children didn't question things that their families, their parents did. I didn't when I was growing up, and they didn't. I mean, they wouldn't have a say-so. I mean, they were little. And but Edward, the baby, had turned 6 years old, and so we thought that this was a doable time. And that sparked my application, the timeliness of my application. And I remember at the end of the interview with Dean Hall, I asked him, I said, Dean Hall, I said, things happen to people, they change their minds, or they just one reason, or they have a wreck, or they, I don't wish misfortune on anyone, but things happen in people's lives and make them change their decisions. Would you please leave my name on the wait list until you've filled your quota? And he said, I'll be glad to do that for you. And I don't know if that answer to his question that I had given him just before then had anything to do with that or not, but I had been told by somebody that if you don't get too glad you're there, if you don't think that you're expendable, then ask to be on the wait list. Don't be too proud to ask to stay there. And you will hear, I guess if we go on much further, I don't give up, because when the dean of the law school, acting dean then, Dent Bostic, asked me, he said, why do you think you need the quality of education that Vanderbilt has to offer when we know that you're going back to Columbia to practice law?
Oh my goodness.
I'll bet my spine tingled, I don't know. Anyway, I was sitting there in my little gloves and my little hat, having this interview, and I said, well, Dean Bostic, I think the people in Murray County deserve the same quality of representation from their lawyers as anyone who lives in any big city in the state. And that's what I intend to do if I'm allowed to come to Vanderbilt and graduate from Vanderbilt Law School. And he appreciated my answer, I think, but I still wasn't in law school until one summer and it must have been in August. Billy had taken Robert with him to go to Lewisburg for something. Every now and then he'd take one of the children with him. It's a great time to be alone with a child. You just interact in a very different way without any interruption. And Dean, I had this telephone call, and he said, Claudia, he said, this is Dean Hall. I said, oh, hello, Dean Hall. How are you doing? He said, I'm doing fine. Do you still want to go to law school? I said, yes, sir, I'd be proud to. And he said, well, I have a space for you. I said, oh, my goodness, when do the classes start? He said, they started at 8 o'clock this morning. I said, oh, my goodness. I said, well, and he said, the next class starts at 1 o'clock. I said, I'll be there. Just let me put my dinner in the oven and get a babysitter, and I'll be right there. And I left with a little black dress and a sweater and came back on Friday afternoon. I think this was on a Tuesday, so I spent Wednesday night and Thursday night with people I met that first day who were so lovely to me, took me home and let me stay with them so I didn't have to drive back and forth. And there I was, off and running.
My goodness. That's pretty memorable.
I remember the first class I attended was Professor McCoy.
Oh, yes.
And he was hard and demanding. And they were talking about Marbury versus Madison. And of course, here we were, first day of class, and he talking about that. And I don't know, I just fell in love with the word mandamus, and I always wanted to file one, and I have filed two. So he did well by me.
I should say so. Well, did you have a trepidation about starting law school, or did you have confidence about it?
Oh, I was scared to death. Hadn't been to school in 15 years and didn't know the difference between jurisdiction and venue. I hadn't paid enough attention to the technical side of the law, so, I had very little vocabulary to relate to what was going on around me, but everyone encouraged me, and I was known as their den mother. They were very deferential to me. We had a goodly number of women in the classes by then, about a third, I think.
So it was no longer exceptional for women to be in law school?
No, not like in the older days where you'd have one or two.
Right. And did you have, were there many students who had been out of college for a good while before starting law school?
No, there were not. I was...
Were you the oldest student in the class?
I don't know. I guess I was. I never thought about that. I was just worried about passing those courses.
But you just mingled and interacted with the students who were in their 20s and...
Oh, they were lovely to me. There was no reason not to. I was included in everything. And then, of course, I don't know if you know about Vanderbilt, but at Vanderbilt on Friday afternoon, when the classes were over, they would have what they call Blackacre.
Yes.
And that was where they had beer and pretzels or something like that in the courtyard. And it was a time for everyone to mix and mingle. And very much fun.
That would be. Well, did you live in Nashville during the week and go back to Columbia on weekends, or did you commute every day?
I did every which way. I rented a dorm room at Peabody and set that up as a room, and when I couldn't go home at night, I would stay there.
You seem to have taken to law school like a duck takes to water.
I wouldn't exactly say that. I don't know how anybody falls in love with it that first semester, but it's so challenging, and the cases were so interesting, and the professors were so kind, even though frightful. I was, I mean, it's a Socratic method, which I had never been exposed to before, but I liked it. And obviously I did all right for myself because I did graduate.
Absolutely. Did you love your studies, though?
I liked most of them, and I took part in a lot of activities that were offered, like moot court.
Yes.
And I was on the Law Review for 2 years, associate editor of the Law Review at Vanderbilt, and the Board of Governors of the Law Association there on campus, and various other things. So I was intermingling with people from both classes. We had an A section and a B section, 180 total, and I got to know many of them personally.
What was going on in your personal life at the time you were excelling in law school?
That was my personal life. I would go home on the weekends and slump over the steering wheel and cry because I had missed my family so much, you know, out of sight, out of mind, sort of. But they, once you have children, you know, they're always on your mind, even today when they're adults.
Certainly, yes.
But I did it. I mean, once I started it, I had no choice but to finish it and make the best of it. And the family all cooperated.
Well, you had 3 young children at the time.
Yes.
And Billy had a chronic condition.
Yes.
And your father-in-law moved into your home?
Yes. The second year in law school, Ms. Jack fell one day at home and was diagnosed with aplastic anemia, which was, I guess it's still fatal. It was then. And so she was placed in Centennial Hospital. And I would go to my classes during the day and go over and spend the night with her in the hospital. She fainted on December the 19th, and she died on the Ides of March, March the 15th. And Dado was squeamish about going to hospitals. He just really didn't like any part of that. And I moved him, went home and moved him into our house, into a spare bedroom, moved Edward out, and we had another bed in our bedroom, so we put him in it, put Edward in it, not Dado. We called him Dado. And I went in to see him one day, and I said, Dado, I want to bargain with you. He said, all right. And I said, if you will take good care of yourself, I promise you I will take good care of Nana. And he said, I can do that. And he did his best to live up to that promise. And I did too.
Oh, I know you did. What did you take away from law school besides what was in the books? What did the experience of law school do to shape your life professionally and personally?
Well, I think the dignity of the law and knowing that you're supporting something that has been in our country since its beginning. Now, I don't want to sound too uppity up here, but I mean, I grew up in a military family. Anytime I heard the Star-Spangled Banner, I stood at attention and put my hand over my heart. That's just the way it was. I don't care where I was. And when I met with a lawyer, I understood what he was doing, even if it were in a field that I didn't understand. I knew that we shared something, and shared something important, because you can't live without laws. You can't live without rules. And sometimes we feel like, oh, rules, rules, rules. We have too many rules. But I guess we need almost every one of them. And today we probably need some more. I mean, people ignore the rules. But you can't as a lawyer. And you realize what a responsibility you hold in your hands to do the best you can, to use the laws that are on the books to do your job.
Well said. With both of their parents being lawyers, did any of your children think about studying law?
Never. Never. They said they heard enough law at the dinner table. They didn't want to go study it. In fact, a funny story, when Robert applied to Vanderbilt when he graduated from high school, he was accepted early decision, and the letter came, and he said, Mother, I've been accepted. And oh, he was so excited. And
Surely.
I said, oh, let me see. And I looked at it and I said, oh, but sugar, they've made a mistake. He said, what? And I said, they've accepted you to the College of Engineering. And he said, well, Mama, that's what I applied for. I said, oh, I didn't know that. I said, what do you know about that? We don't know anything about engineering. We're not mathematicians. He said, but it's what I want to do. I said, well, good for you. Mm-hmm. You made an independent decision.
Exactly, exactly. Well, now here we are with you finishing law school. You're about to emerge from law school. What did you do about hunting for a job? Did you go through the typical law firm interview process, or what were you interested in doing upon your graduation from law school?
My ultimate goal was to go home and practice law with Billy, mm-hmm. and that if his physical condition became worse and I understood what he was doing, that I could be his legs in a stronger way than just as a homemaker. Mm-hmm. And as it turned out, it was absolutely the right decision for us to make, that I go. And my life has been rewarded many times over for the experience, both in law school and as a practicing lawyer.
I should say so. So what was your first job after law school?
The second year of law school, you know, everyone's interviewing. Big firms came down and, you saw people that had been wearing sandals and Bermuda shorts all of a sudden had on coats and ties.
Pinstripe suits.
Oh, and they're putting their best foot forward. And I didn't interview because, of course, I was going home.
Yes.
And several professors that I had encouraged me to apply for a clerkship with a Tennessee judge. You're going to be in Tennessee, you're going to practice Tennessee law, learn what it takes for you to build your record to go to appeal. And so I applied. There was a vacancy with Justice William J. Harbison, and his father had lived in Columbia. In fact, I practiced out of his law office in what was, at that time that Mr. Harbison was a lawyer, was called the Brown Building. Looked right out over the courthouse square. And so I made an appointment and, you know, wrote my letter and sent my writing sample and all that to Justice Harbison. And he interviewed me and hired me. And that was that. It was the most wonderful experience in my life. Until the next one.
I should say so. And just for the record, Justice Harbison had previously practiced with the distinguished Nashville firm of Tribune, Sturdivant, and DeWitt,
yes,
which then became Miller and Martin, and which is now the Butler Snow law firm.
How things grow.
Yes, and his son Bill Harbison is a prominent lawyer here in Nashville in his own right with the Sherrard and Rowe law firm. So the Harbison family has really made a mark on the legal profession in Tennessee.
Absolutely. His sister was Justice Harbison's daughter is a doctor, mm-hmm. and Bill Harbison is going to be I think he's going to be our next president of the Tennessee Bar Association. Yes. Just a fine man, and we've maintained a strong friendship through the years.
Indeed. What was it like to clerk for Justice Harbison?
Oh my goodness. It was so wonderful. Of course, the office, I thought I was in the governor's office. It was the biggest office I'd ever seen, and I was told it would be the largest office and the most well-equipped office that I would ever have, and that turned out to be true. We had these, my job was to write memoranda of law, and I would read the facts and analyze whatever was before me and prepare it in a form that we had called a memorandum of law, and then Justice Harbison would consider that when they decided whether they were going to take cases, you know, accept cases, because you had to get permission at that time. Yes. And unless they were extraordinary cases yes. that they had to take, and so that's what I did, and it was very exciting because he knew everything. I don't know why he needed me. He didn't really need me, but he had me, so I guess it felt like he had to do something with me. But I remember after about the third or fourth case that he gave me was, the characters were Tim and Toad, and it was a dispute over a trust and who was going to benefit from the trust. And I studied and studied and studied, and I thought, oh Lord, I'm going to be fired for sure. I cannot find the corpus. Well, trust was not my strong class in law school, but I did learn that much about them, that you had to have one.
There has to be a corpus.
And so I tapped lightly on Justice Harbison's door and came in. He was very shy, so I was timid to go in. And I said, Justice Harbison, I'm trying to write this memorandum, but I can't. It's about a trust, and I cannot find the corpus. I said, you do have to have one, don't you? And he said, yes. And so I went back, and I never could find the corpus. So I just told him, I said, I failed on this one because I cannot find it. Turned out there was not one. And it sort of sealed a bond between us. I think he wasn't expecting me to question it like that. And then he thought when he looked at what I'd been looking at, he'd find out I was wrong. But I was right. And I don't say that it made us jolly friends, because he was so revered by everyone, and especially me. But he did seem to have a newfound respect for my abilities.
I'm sure
we got along well.
I'm sure he appreciated and respected you, and that gave you a boost of confidence too in your work for the rest of your clerkship. Well, we will take another break for a short few minutes here and then resume.
Thank you.